She mistook him for the caretaker. He never once corrected her. If you love slow-burn winter romances with a twist of justice, hit subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss a story from Winter Vale, and stay with us tonight, because this one earns every minute. Dear friends, I have always believed that snow has a strange kindness to it, the way it covers old wounds in white and gives a place a reason to start over. Tonight's story is about a man who buried his grief the way frost buries a garden, and the woman who thought it without even trying. I hope it warms you the way it warmed me while I wrote it. White Birch, New Hampshire, was already buried under 6 inches of fresh snow by the time Josephine Fairfield turned her truck through the stone gates of the old Langley estate. The mountains rose gray and silent behind the trees, and a thin curl of wood smoke drifted from somewhere near the main house. This was the biggest contract of her career, and she could not afford to make a bad first impression. She was 27, undeniably beautiful in an unpolished way, with honey brown hair pulled into a loose braid beneath her knit hat and warm brown eyes that missed very little. She parked beside a long row of frozen hedges, gathered her rolled landscape plans from the passenger seat, and stepped out into air so cold it stung her lungs. The property stretched farther than she could see, white fields folding into dark pine forest, and somewhere beyond a low stone wall, she could hear the rhythmic scrape of a shovel against a walkway. Josephine followed the sound around the corner of an old carriage house and found a man clearing snow from a narrow garden path. He was tall and broad-shouldered, unmistakably handsome, even bundled in a heavy flannel jacket dusted white at the shoulders, work gloves, and a wool cap pulled low over dark hair. He looked up when her boots crunched the fresh powder, quiet gray-blue eyes finding hers, and his smile arrived before his words did. "Good morning," she said, hugging the tube of drawings to her chest. "I'm looking for Mr. Langley. Could you let him know Josephine Fairfield is here about the garden restoration?" The man leaned the shovel against the wall and studied her for a moment longer than felt necessary. "I can do that," he said simply. She handed him a folded copy of her business card without thinking twice. "And you might tell him his caretaker takes better care of this path than most people take of their own driveways," she added with a small laugh, nodding at the perfectly cleared stone beneath her boots. Something flickered behind his eyes, quiet and amused. "I'll pass that along," he said. Josephine walked toward the main house, glancing back once. The man had already returned to shoveling, steady and unhurried, as if her visit had barely registered. She smiled to herself. He's got a nice face for someone who spends all day fighting snow. She had no idea that the man with the shovel owned every acre she was standing on, and for reasons she could not yet imagine, he had decided not to tell her. The inside of the house startled her more than the outside had. High timber ceilings, a stone fireplace taller than she was, and windows that framed the white mountains like paintings. A woman in a cardigan met her in the entryway with a warm mug already in hand. "Miss Fairfield," she said, "Mr. Langley asked us to bring you something hot while you set up." "He knows I'm here already," Josephine said, surprised. The woman smiled. "He always knows who's on the property." 15 minutes later, Josephine had her drawings spread across a long farmhouse table near a window overlooking the frozen garden. She waited for the owner to appear. Instead, the same man from outside walked in carrying 2 mugs, snow still melting off his boots. "For the designer," he said, setting one down beside her elbow. She thanked him and, out of curiosity, asked if he wanted to look at the plans while they waited. He studied the sketches longer than she expected, tracing one finger along a redrawn path near the eastern hedge. "You moved the sledding hill," he said. "It gets more sun there in February," she explained proudly. He nodded slowly. "True, but the kids from the valley have been sledding down the old slope every winter for 20 years. They'll notice." Josephine blinked. "You know the local kids?" "I watch the hill most winters," he said. "It's good work if someone's paying attention." The hours that followed felt strangely easy. Every time Josephine needed an extra pair of hands, the caretaker appeared. "Could you hold this end of the tape measure?" "Of course." "Could you help me stake this line before the wind picks up?" "No problem." He never rushed, never complained, and never once acted as though the work was beneath him, even when she asked him to kneel in the snow and hold a string level for 20 freezing minutes. Around midday, Josephine blew warm air into her cupped hands. "You know," she said, "I'm telling your boss you deserve a raise." The man considered this with mock seriousness. I would not say no to that. She laughed. You actually expect one. I never turn down a compliment, especially a free one, he said, and something about the easy rhythm between them made the cold feel less sharp than it had that morning. As the afternoon wore on, Josephine talked more than she meant to. She told him about the client in Burlington who wanted palm trees in a state that got 8 feet of snow a year, about the time she killed an entire greenhouse of orchids in a single week, about her mother's old saying that anything could survive a New England winter if you were stubborn enough to keep it alive. He mostly listened, asking short questions, watching her with quiet attention that made her forget she was supposed to be working. Late in the day, she pointed toward a cluster of old sugar maples near the property line. Those should probably come out, she said. They're blocking the view from the terrace. The caretaker's expression changed so fast it startled her. No, he said. Those stay. Josephine frowned. I'm the landscape designer. That's kind of the problem, she said, half joking. He did not smile back this time. You've been here one day, he said, his voice suddenly flat. I've been walking this ground for 30 years. Neither of them laughed this time. Josephine finally threw up her hands. I don't understand why you're being so protective of a few trees. Without a word, the man walked toward the maples and knelt in the snow, brushing away a drift with his bare glove until a small weathered plaque appeared, half buried at the base of the largest trunk. Josephine stepped closer and read the words carved into the tarnished brass. Thomas Langley, Ski Patrol, taught this whole mountain to breathe. The man beside her touched the frozen metal gently. My father tapped these trees every February, he said. He used to say a sugar maple remembers every winter it survives. He died on this ridge during a storm when I was 19. My mother planted these to mark the exact spot. Josephine felt her face flush with shame. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I didn't know. I know you couldn't have, he said, standing and brushing the snow from his knees. I should have said something before you drew that line through them. She looked down at her sketch, suddenly ashamed of every neat, confident mark she had made. I should have asked first, she said. He offered her a small, forgiving smile. Now you know. That evening, as Josephine packed away her drawings, an elegant older woman crossed the garden with a lantern swinging gently in her gloved hand. You must be the designer, the woman said warmly. I'm Nadine, Gabriel's grandmother. Josephine froze mid-step. Gabriel? The caretaker's name is Gabriel? Nadine's eyes crinkled with quiet amusement. Is that what he told you he was, dear? The caretaker? Josephine's stomach dropped. He never said he wasn't, she admitted. Nadine chuckled softly, glancing toward the man now coiling a hose near the barn. That sounds exactly like him, she said. He has never once let anyone touch this garden before, not since his mother passed. She tilted her head, studying Josephine with sudden interest. So tell me, why do you think he let you? The question followed Josephine home that night and refused to leave her alone. If Gabriel Langley had never allowed anyone near this garden before, why had he agreed to her, a stranger with rolled-up sleeves and too many opinions about maple trees? She arrived earlier than usual the next morning, determined to find out, and was not the least bit surprised to find him already outside, clearing frost from the porch steps before the sun had fully risen. You really do start before sunrise, she said. The garden doesn't like to be kept waiting, he answered without looking up. She laughed. I can't tell if you're serious all the time. Usually, he admitted. That sounds exhausting. It probably is, he said, and something in his voice made her want to keep talking to him for the rest of the day. As they walked the grounds together, Josephine noticed things she had missed the first day. Every section of the property told a story if you looked closely enough. A cluster of paper birches planted in a perfect circle. A weathered wooden bench facing nothing but an open field. A narrow, snow-dusted path that curved strangely around an old stone well instead of taking the shorter route past it. Can I ask you something? She said. You just did, he answered, and she rolled her eyes. Why does every part of this place feel so personal? Gabriel was quiet for a moment, watching his breath fog in the cold air. Then, almost reluctantly, he began to talk. My mother planted the birches, he said. She used to say white bark against gray sky was the only thing that made January bearable. He led her to the wooden bench facing the open field. My little brother used to sit right here every single evening, he said, waiting for the northern lights that almost never came. He still hasn't given up. He's 26 now, and he still texts me every time the forecast mentions aurora activity. Josephine smiled softly. That's sweet. It's exhausting, Gabriel said, but his voice had softened too. They stopped last beside the old stone well with its strange curved path. My father built that cover by hand the winter before he died, he said. He believed the well deserved to be protected from the frost the same as anything living. Josephine looked down at her notes. Instead of measurements, she had started writing down stories. Birches, mother, brother, northern lights, father. Well, I've been designing this garden all wrong, she admitted. Gabriel looked at her. What do you mean? I've been arranging plants, she said. I should have been arranging memories. Gabriel looked at her the way someone looks at another person they have just started to actually see. I think you're finally meeting the place, he said. That afternoon, Josephine tore up her original sketches and started again from nothing. Gone were the sweeping symmetrical paths and the dramatic redesign she had been so proud of that first morning. In their place, every memory found a shape in the landscape. The maple stayed untouched. The birch circle grew wider instead of smaller. The winding path around the well remained exactly where it had always curved. When she finally showed him the new plans, Gabriel studied them for a long time in silence. My mother would have loved this, he finally said. Josephine felt something warm settle in her chest despite the cold. I hope the caretaker approves too, she teased. He almost smiled. I'll check with him in the morning, he said, and for a moment the joke between them felt like something else entirely. Over the following days they worked side by side, almost constantly. Somewhere along the way the project stopped feeling like work and started feeling like something they were building together. One frozen morning, Josephine insisted on setting the new fence posts herself, gloves and all, while Gabriel stood nearby pretending not to worry about her freezing fingers every few minutes. You know, she said, wiping frost from her eyebrows, I'm going to tell everyone I met the love of my life while he was pretending to be his own groundskeeper. Gabriel's ears turned pink, and not from the cold. I never said I was pretending, he said carefully. You let me believe it, she countered, pointing her frozen glove at him. He shrugged, entirely unbothered. You never asked directly. She threw a small handful of snow at him without warning, and it caught him square in the shoulder. He stared at her, stunned, snow still clinging to his flannel jacket. Josephine burst out laughing. I've been carrying 500-pound bags of mulch for you for 3 days, she said between breaths. This felt fair. Gabriel bent down, scooped a handful of snow of his own, and the entire garden erupted into chaos for the next 10 minutes. By the time they collapsed against the porch railing, breathless and soaked, something between them had shifted in a way neither of them said out loud. Nadine watched from the kitchen window with a knowing smile, already reaching for her phone to text Gabriel's brother the news he had been waiting years to hear. Some things, she said to herself, only need snow and time. One Thursday afternoon, Josephine walked toward the main lodge carrying a folder she'd been told needed a final signature from the property owner before the county would approve permits. She assumed it would take 5 quiet minutes. Instead, she opened the door to a room full of men and women in dark business suits seated around a long conference table, laptops open, voices low and serious. I think I'm in the wrong room, she said, hovering in the doorway. An assistant near the door shook her head gently. No, the meeting's about to start, she said, gesturing toward an open seat near the back. Confused, Josephine sat down just as the double doors opened and every single person in the room rose to their feet at once. Gabriel walked in wearing a charcoal suit instead of a flannel jacket, snow no longer clinging to his broad shoulders, looking almost unfairly handsome for a man who had spent the morning arguing with an ice storm, his voice suddenly carrying the calm authority of someone used to being obeyed. Good morning, Mr. Langley, one executive said, sliding a stack of papers toward him. Your signature is needed here, sir, said another. Josephine stared, her mouth slightly open, as person after person addressed him by a title she had never once heard him use. When his eyes finally found hers across the room, Gabriel offered the same quiet smile he had worn while clearing snow off the porch steps 2 weeks earlier. After the meeting ended, Josephine marched straight up to him, still trying to process what she had just watched. You, she said. He nodded once. I own the resort, he said simply, and the mountain, and most of this valley, technically, and the maple syrup company. I might have left a few things out. Josephine pressed both hands over her face. "I told you to ask your boss for a raise," she said, muffled. "I appreciated the gesture," he answered. "I threw snow at you. You deserved retaliation either way," he said, and despite everything, she laughed until her eyes watered. "You are impossible," she told him. "So I've heard," he said, and this time his smile reached all the way to his eyes. That evening, wandering the grounds while the sky turned violet with early dusk, Josephine passed an old glass conservatory tucked behind a stand of frozen pines. Unlike every other corner of the estate, this one looked completely untouched, vines frozen against the panes, snow undisturbed on the roof, the heavy iron door sealed with a rusted padlock. She reached for the handle out of pure curiosity. It wouldn't budge. She glanced across the lawn and saw Gabriel standing several yards away, watching her hand on the frozen door. The easy warmth drained out of his expression completely, something she hadn't seen from him before. He turned without a word and walked back toward the house, his boots leaving deep prints in the fresh snow. And Josephine stood alone beside the locked glass room, wondering what could possibly make a man who cared for every inch of his land abandon one small piece of it entirely. She couldn't stop thinking about the conservatory after that. Every morning, she noticed the long path she now took to avoid walking past it. Every evening, she noticed Gabriel doing the same thing, only in the opposite direction, always glancing away as if the glass building no longer belonged to him at all. She didn't ask, not right away, because she had started to understand that Gabriel never hid things to seem mysterious. He simply waited until he was ready to open them. A few days later, while planting a row of frost-hardy hollies near the back fence, she finally worked up the nerve. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You usually do," he answered, not looking up from the soil. "I've been wondering about the conservatory," she said carefully. His hands stilled for only a second before he kept working. "What about it?" he asked. "You've shown me every part of this property except that one," she said. Gabriel finally sat back on his heels and looked toward the frozen glass building in the distance. When he spoke, his voice had none of its usual steadiness. "That was my mother's," he said. "Every orchid, every winter rose, every seed tray in there belonged to her. She used to say a conservatory was the only place in New Hampshire where a person could grow something soft in the middle of the coldest month of the year." He was quiet for a long moment before continuing. "She died 4 winters ago, in February," he said. "I locked the door the week of the funeral. I told myself I'd go back in the spring. Then the spring after that. Then I stopped telling myself anything at all." Josephine felt her chest tighten. "You never went back?" she said softly. "I wasn't afraid of the flowers," he admitted. "I was afraid that when I opened that door, she really wouldn't be in there anymore." Josephine wanted, more than anything, to tell him to open it, to let go, to finally step inside. Instead, she simply nodded and said, "Okay." Gabriel looked at her, surprised. "Okay," she repeated. "You don't have to open it for me, or for the project, or for anyone. When you're ready, it will still be there waiting." For the first time in 4 years, someone had not tried to fix his grief. She had simply sat beside it. From that day forward, Josephine never mentioned the conservatory again, pouring her energy instead into the rest of the grounds, the maple grove, the birch circle, the winding path by the well. Gabriel noticed. He never thanked her for it directly, but every morning after that his smile arrived a little sooner, and he started leaving a second mug of coffee waiting for her on the porch rail before she even climbed out of her truck. Then, on a bitter evening in late January, a storm rolled down off the mountain faster than anyone expected. Wind rattled the windows of the main lodge, and somewhere in the dark a branch cracked and fell against the old glass roof of the conservatory. Gabriel and Josephine both froze at the sound, then ran toward it together through snow that had already begun piling against their knees. The old rusted chain on the conservatory door had finally given way under the weight of the fallen branch, and the heavy iron door hung open, swinging gently in the wind. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Josephine looked at Gabriel's face in the porch light and said, "You don't have to." He swallowed hard, then took one slow step forward, and then another, crossing a threshold he had avoided for 4 winters. Inside, dust hung thick in the beam of his flashlight. Broken clay pots sat exactly where they had been abandoned. A faded pair of gardening gloves still hung on a hook beside the door. Then Josephine gasped and pointed toward the center of the glass room, where a single winter rose bush stood alive among the frozen wreckage, its dark green leaves impossibly untouched. One pale white bloom opened toward the frosted ceiling. Gabriel sank to his knees in front of it, his hand trembling as he touched the delicate petal. A tear slid down his face before he could stop it, and then another. Josephine knelt silently beside him in the cold, damp air, saying nothing, simply staying close while he grieved and marveled at the flower his mother had somehow left alive for him to find, for winters later, exactly when he finally needed it. While clearing dust from an old wooden workbench days later, Josephine found a leather gardening journal tucked beneath a stack of empty seed packets. Gabriel opened it slowly, flipping past pages of planting dates and pressed flower sketches until a folded note slipped loose near the back. Josephine unfolded it carefully and began reading aloud in the quiet, dusty room. "If Gabriel ever opens this greenhouse again," the note began, "it means he isn't healing because of the flowers." Her voice softened as she read the final line. "It means he's healing because someone finally walked in with him." Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Gabriel looked around the little glass room, the empty pots, the single surviving rose, and then he looked at Josephine, standing beside him in the frozen light. He had spent 4 years believing healing required more time, more distance, more strength he did not have. His mother had understood something he hadn't. He hadn't needed another winter to pass. He had needed one person willing to walk through the cold with him instead of waiting outside for him to come out on his own. Without thinking, he reached for Josephine's hand, and she held it without hesitation. For 2 weeks after that night, the estate seemed to breathe easier. The new garden paths were finished. The conservatory was carefully cleaned and restocked with fresh soil, the winter rose given a place of honor near the center bed. Everything felt like it was finally settling into place, until an email arrived early one morning that Josephine almost deleted without reading. The sender line said the New England Landscape Guild. Her hands began shaking before she finished the first paragraph. She had won the Regional Design Award for her work at the estate, and along with it came an invitation to lead a year-long fellowship rebuilding the winter gardens at a historic estate in Chicago, the kind of opportunity people spent entire careers chasing and rarely got. Gabriel was the first person she told, standing in the frost by the maple grove. He smiled immediately, and it looked genuine even though something behind his eyes dimmed slightly. "That's incredible," he said. "You should go." She searched his face carefully. "You really mean that?" "I do," he said. "This is everything you've worked for." She smiled back, but somehow his support made the thought of leaving hurt more than if he had asked her to stay. With just under 2 weeks left before her flight to Chicago, an unexpected letter arrived at the estate addressed to Gabriel's private office, and its contents changed everything. It came from his cousin, Barnaby Crowell, a name Josephine had heard mentioned only once, in passing, weeks earlier. Barnaby sat on the family trust that technically still controlled the resort land, and the letter demanded an emergency meeting within the week. Gabriel read the letter twice at the kitchen table, his jaw tightening with every line. "Barnaby claims I've been neglecting the business," he told Josephine, sliding the papers across to her. "He says spending months on garden restoration instead of resort expansion proves I'm unfit to manage the trust alone. He's calling for a vote to strip me of sole executor status before the spring board meeting." Josephine frowned, reading further down the page. "This isn't just about the trust," she said slowly. "Look at this clause here. If the vote passes, Barnaby gets emergency authority over undeveloped estate land, including the maple grove and the conservatory, pending the board's final decision." Gabriel's face went pale. "He's been planning to sell this ridge to a developer for a lift expansion for years," he said, his jaw tight. "My mother's grove would be gone in a season." The following morning, without warning, 3 trucks rumbled up the private road toward the estate, followed by a man in an expensive wool coat who stepped out even before the engine stopped. Barnaby Crowell had his cousin's same dark hair and none of his warmth, his smile sharp and practiced as he surveyed the property like a buyer inspecting merchandise rather than family land. "Gabriel," he said coolly, stepping past him toward the maple grove without waiting for a greeting. "I brought a survey crew. Nothing gets touched until the vote, of course, but the board wants updated measurements before Thursday." Gabriel stepped directly into his path. "You are not walking onto this land," he said, his voice low and hard in a way Josephine had never heard from him before. Barnaby's smile did not waver. "I have every legal right, cousin," he said, holding up a folded document. "Emergency access clause, pending trust review, signed by the board attorney this morning." He turned to the crew waiting by the trucks. "Start with the birch stand," he called out. "It's slated for the parking structure anyway." Josephine's hands went cold. That had nothing to do with the weather as two men began unloading stakes and orange flagging tape. Gabriel's hands curled into fists at his sides. "That grove marks where my father died," he said. For just a second, something flickered across Barnaby's face that looked less like irritation than fear. There, and gone so fast Josephine almost missed it. "Sentiment doesn't run a resort, Gabriel," Barnaby said, his voice climbing half a register higher than before. "The lift lines have been losing money for 3 seasons while you've been out here planting flowers with your girlfriend. Someone in this family has to think about the future instead of the past." Josephine stepped forward before she could stop herself. "Your future plan involves bulldozing a memorial and a woman's greenhouse," she said sharply. Barnaby's eyes flicked toward her, cold and appraising. "And who exactly are you?" he asked, "to have an opinion about a family trust?" "I'm the landscape architect who redesigned this entire property around the people your family actually lost," she said, refusing to look away. Barnaby laughed, short and humorless. "How touching," he said. "Gabriel, if this is the level of judgment you're exercising these days, hiring a stranger who redraws 40-year-old maple lines based on feelings, the board is going to have an easier decision than I thought." He turned back to his crew. "Flag the eastern boundary too," he called out. "Straight through the old glass house." Gabriel moved fast, stepping directly in front of the surveyor's stake before it touched the frozen ground near the conservatory. "That building does not get flagged," he said, his voice carrying across the whole yard now. "Not today, not Thursday, not ever." Barnaby folded his arms, unbothered. "Then convince the board in person," he said. "Otherwise the paperwork does the talking for you, and paperwork doesn't care about roses." That night, Gabriel sat at the kitchen table long after the survey crew had finally packed up and left, staring at the trust documents without really seeing them. Josephine sat across from him, watching the exhaustion settle deeper into his face than she had ever seen it. "He'll get enough votes," Gabriel said, rubbing his eyes. "2 board members already think I've lost focus." "He's not entirely wrong, either." "He hasn't lost anything," Josephine said firmly. "He found something. There's a difference." Gabriel looked up at her, and for a moment the fear in his eyes was almost unbearable to watch. "If I lose Thursday's vote," he said, "everything my parents built out there gets bulldozed before summer, and there is nothing I can legally do to stop it." Josephine reached across the table and took his hand. "Then we don't lose Thursday," she said. For the next 3 days, Josephine barely slept, working alongside Gabriel and Nadine to gather every document, letter, and photograph that proved the estate's restoration had already increased local tourism revenue, protected historic maple production, and drawn regional recognition through her own award-winning design work. Nadine, silver-haired and steady, sat up past midnight organizing decades of family financial records with a determination that surprised even her grandson. On the second night, Nadine set down her reading glasses and slid a printed article across the table without a word. Josephine picked it up. It was a small item from a regional business paper, 6 months old, reporting that Crowell Ridge, Barnaby's own modest resort 2 towns over, had missed payments on a construction loan. "I called an old friend on the county planning board this afternoon," Nadine said. "Barnaby isn't trying to save this family's future, sweetheart. He's trying to save his own bank account before the auditors start asking questions." Gabriel read the article twice, his expression hardening into something quieter and sadder than anger. "He's drowning," he said finally, "and he decided our mother's roses were an acceptable price for staying afloat." "I raised that boy through 2 funerals," Nadine said, her voice steady but tired. "I am not about to let his cousin bury the only living thing his mother left behind because of a spreadsheet." Josephine reached over and squeezed the older woman's hand, and for a brief, tender moment neither of them said anything else at all, the fire crackling softly in the silence between them. Thursday morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of hard blue sky that follows a heavy snowfall. The boardroom at the resort lodge filled slowly with trust members, attorneys, and Barnaby, already seated at the head of the table as though the outcome were a formality. Gabriel walked in wearing the same charcoal suit from weeks earlier, Josephine and Nadine close behind him, a thick folder of evidence in Josephine's hands. Barnaby opened smoothly, listing quarterly losses, unfinished lift maintenance, and what he called a troubling personal distraction that had pulled Gabriel's focus away from the business for months. He gestured toward Josephine without looking at her directly. I move that the board grant emergency development authority over undeveloped estate acreage, effective immediately, he said, sliding papers toward the attorney. Before the vote could be called, Josephine stood, her voice steady despite the shaking in her hands. "If I may," she said, and the room went quiet enough to hear the old radiators ticking. She laid out, point by point, the tourism increase already documented since the garden restoration began, the Regional Design Award now bringing national press attention to the estate, and the Maple Grove's irreplaceable role in a syrup operation worth more, long-term, than any parking structure. Then she opened the leather journal Gabriel's mother had left behind and read aloud the final lines about healing and walking through grief together, not to sway sentiment, she said, but because Barnaby had called this family's history a distraction, and every board member in this room needed to understand exactly what they were being asked to erase for a lift expansion that hadn't turned a profit in 3 years. Last, she set the article about Crowell Ridge on the table and slid it toward him. And perhaps, she added quietly, the board should also ask whose bank account this emergency vote is actually meant to rescue. Barnaby's composure cracked for the first time. "This is a business meeting, not a memorial service," he snapped, his eyes darting to the article and then away, refusing to touch it. One of the oldest trust members, a quiet woman who had said nothing until that moment, finally spoke. "Barnaby," she said evenly, "I have sat on this board for 22 years, and I have never once seen a report as thorough or a piece of land managed as thoughtfully as what these two young people just presented to us. And I have never once seen a man argue this hard against his own family without a very personal reason." A vote was called. Hands rose slowly, one after another, around the long table. When the count was finished, only Barnaby's hand remained in the air. He stared at it for a long moment, then lowered it slowly, his jaw tight, his eyes hard as he gathered his papers without a word and walked out of the room, the door clicking shut behind him with quiet, final finality. Later that week, word reached Gabriel through the family attorney that Barnaby had finally sold Crowell Ridge outright to cover the default rather than face the bank publicly. Gabriel did not celebrate the news. Instead, he sat by the fire with Nadine that evening and said only that he hoped his cousin found something solid enough to stand on eventually, because losing a father teaches a person that bitterness never actually fills the hole grief leaves behind, no matter how much land a person tries to pile on top of it. Outside the lodge, snow had begun falling again in soft, unhurried flakes, settling over the maple grove and the little glass conservatory like something protective. Gabriel exhaled a long breath he seemed to have been holding for days. "It's over," he murmured, almost as if he didn't quite believe it yet. Josephine slipped her hand into his. "Not over," she said, "just finally safe." The days that followed felt almost ordinary again, and Josephine was grateful for every quiet one of them. She and Gabriel repaired the fence the survey crew had trampled, restocked the conservatory shelves Barnaby's people had never actually reached, and let the estate settle back into the slow, unhurried rhythm it had before any of it began. But her suitcase still sat by the door of her rented room in town, and the date on her plane ticket had not moved with the calendar. 2 nights before her flight, standing together at the edge of the maple grove as a fresh storm thickened around them, Gabriel turned to face her, snow catching in his dark hair. "I need to tell you something before you leave for Chicago," he said. Josephine's heart tightened. He continued carefully, "I am not going to ask you to stay. If I did, you would always wonder what you gave up to make me happy, and I refuse to be someone's regret." Josephine felt tears sting her eyes despite the cold. "Then why does it feel like you're saying goodbye?" she whispered. Gabriel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small terracotta pot, a young cutting from the winter rose already sprouting new green leaves against the frost. "I propagated this from the greenhouse," he said. "Wherever you go, some part of this place goes with you. That's not goodbye. That's a promise. She held the little pod against her chest, unable to speak for a long moment. You don't have to choose between your dream and the people who believe in it, he said. If this flower can survive being replanted somewhere new, I think we can survive a little distance too, he added softly. Without another word, Josephine stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, and he held her gently in the falling snow, neither of them promising forever, both of them somehow certain of it anyway. 9 months later, Josephine Fairfield came home to White Birch without calling ahead. The Chicago Fellowship had given her everything she had once dreamed of: new commissions, a national reputation. And yet every garden she designed that year reminded her of one particular ridge in New Hampshire buried in snow. She wanted her return to be a surprise, not an announcement. Walking through the stone gates, she immediately noticed something new near the eastern hedge: a carved wooden sign reading the Four Seasons Garden. Curious, she followed the path inside and found spring blending gently into summer, summer folding into autumn, autumn opening quietly into winter, and at the very center, beneath the frost, the winter rose bush had grown thick and full, blooming pale white against the snow. She heard the familiar scrape of a shovel before she saw him. Gabriel stood near the conservatory in the same old flannel jacket, snow dusting his shoulders exactly as it had the first morning they met. Josephine laughed despite the tightness in her throat. "So the caretaker's still hard at work?" she called out. Gabriel looked up, and his whole face changed at once. "And the designer finally came home," he said. She crossed the frozen garden without another word and walked straight into his arms. He held her close as though the 9 months between them had simply melted away like the last stubborn patch of April snow. "I missed this place," she whispered against his shoulder. "I know," he murmured. "You never stopped talking about it, even from 4 states away." She laughed softly. "I guess I didn't. And I never stopped waiting," he said. A few weeks later, family and close friends gathered beneath the old maple grove for a small wedding. No grand ballroom. Only flowers they had planted together and a canopy of birch branches strung with fairy lights against the early winter sky. Josephine looked breathtaking in a simple ivory dress, her honey brown hair loose around her shoulders for once. And Gabriel, watching her walk toward him through the snow, looked exactly like a man who could not believe his own luck. When the officiant asked when Josephine first knew she was falling in love, she laughed through happy tears and said, "The day I mistook him for the caretaker." Everyone smiled. Gabriel looked at her before answering the same question himself. "I never corrected her," he said simply. The officiant raised an eyebrow, curious. "No," Gabriel said, shaking his head slowly. "For the first time in my life, someone saw the man holding the shovel before she ever saw the name on the deed, and I wasn't about to ruin that by explaining myself too soon." As the ceremony ended, snow began to fall softly over the maple grove, dusting the birch circle and settling gently on the glass roof of the conservatory, where a single winter rose bloomed brighter than any flower had a right to in the middle of a New Hampshire winter. Nadine wiped a quiet tear from her cheek near the back row, watching the family her son and daughter-in-law had built finally come full circle beneath the snow they had loved so much. There are moments in life when we believe we have met the wrong person entirely, only to discover later that we simply met the right one wearing the wrong clothes for the weather. Josephine thought she was talking to a caretaker. Gabriel never cared enough about titles to correct her, and perhaps that is exactly why they found each other's hearts long before they ever noticed each other's fortunes. This story is a reminder that the strongest love is rarely built on first impressions or perfect timing. It is built one shoveled path at a time, one honest conversation at a time, one winter survived together at a time. Like a garden buried under snow, love does not disappear in the cold season. It simply waits, quietly, for someone patient enough to wait with it until spring finally arrives. Before you go, we would love to hear from you. If you fell in love with someone without knowing their title, their wealth, or their name in the paper, would you still choose them once you finally learn the truth? If this story warmed you tonight, please subscribe to Winter Veil so you never miss the next one, and we will see you again very soon, bundled up and ready for another story from the snow.